quiet stillness of the emergency room was suddenly disrupted by the blaring sirens. The ambulance screeched to a halt in front of the door, and 2 gurneys were quickly wheeled inside. 2 people, a brother and a sister, the woman herself pregnant, were involved in a car accident on a remote highway some 15 miles from the hospital at which they now found themselves. Neither person had any broken bones, but both had serious lacerations and had lost much blood. A dangerous amount of blood, in fact, because both of them had been unconscious and unattended for over 30 minutes. The breathless march of death could be heard in the distance until one crucial thing happened: a transfusion. Both the brother and the sister received several units of blood, and the tide began to change. Their vital signs improved, they stabilized, and soon they would walk out of the hospital scarred but well. Guys, your body can do without a lot of things, but it cannot survive without blood. My sister and I learned that, though we had to learn it in hindsight, because when you're involved in a car accident, you don't have time to think, you don't have time to put your life in order, you don't have time, as some of us grew up believing, if you have that little 5-second window before you see your imminent death to throw up one last, "Hail Jesus, please forgive." It's just there, lights out, you wake up and find out you danced along the tightrope of death. Not because of a broken neck, not because of necessarily a head injury, though those things happen, but because of the loss of blood. When you cut yourself on your face, particularly on your forehead or on your wrists, though the skin is thin, you bleed, as we used to say in Texas, like a stuck pig. You bleed profusely. And as we lay on a remote highway, far away from anybody, we learned in hindsight that blood is so very vital to life. It is the essential element in life. You can break off your teeth, as I did, and as long as you don't go or drink cold things, you can survive. You can lose an eye. You can lose a limb. You can live without things like an appendix. You can live with 1 kidney, though you have 2. You can live without your larynx. In fact, doctors are very close to perfecting an artificial heart. Can you believe that? I mean, they've been putting pig valves in people for a long time, but an artificial heart. You can almost live without your God-given heart, but you cannot live without blood. They can't drain you of blood and fill you up with something else and live. When you lose your blood completely, you're a corpse. Medical science has done much, but it has not accomplished this feat. My former colleague, to whom I often refer, Charles Lincoln, we called him Abe, 67 years old, died because of this principle. One Friday morning he woke up with a backache. He thought that he had slept funny, as we sometimes do, and felt stiff, and at 67 he was still active, but getting older, as I said earlier, and noticing the aches and pains more frequently. So his back hurt, and so he said, "Shug, Dot, my back's hurting, maybe I should go to the chiropractor." Well, as the day progressed, it went from his back all the way up to the back of his neck, to his chest. To make a long story short, by 6 o'clock that night, he was nearly comatose. He began to bleed from the corners of his mouth, from the corners of his eyes. Blood began to come from his ears and from every other orifice on his body, and they didn't know what to do, and they rushed him to the hospital. And Kelly and I, as we celebrated our anniversary that night at a Phillips, Craig and Dean concert, called home, and people were looking for us as my colleague lay in the emergency room, and by midnight that night, Abe was dead. The CDC was called in because his symptoms were similar to those found in African viruses like Ebola. His skin was literally gray from lividity because he exsanguinated. That's a big word for you today, exsanguinate. It means to bleed out. Regardless of what it was that caused that, the CDC studied it for 3 months and couldn't figure anything out. Maybe he got some foreign bacteria. Maybe he got some foreign virus when he went to Guyana in South America. Maybe he got it on his toothbrush. Maybe he picked up some sort of animal fecal matter in the water system there. No one knows. But on the death certificate, the cause of death was exsanguination. He bled out. His inner organs turned loose, and the blood ran freely. And as the heart could not pump anything, he died from exsanguination, because your body can do without a lot of things, but it cannot do without blood. In fact, blood is the sine qua non, our word for the day. Sine qua non is a Latin phrase that has survived for many, many years, and it literally means without which not. Sine qua non means without which not, which doesn't make any sense unless you put it in the context of a sentence or an idea. Without which not, you go, what does that mean? That doesn't mean anything. Well, it doesn't if you just read it like that. But if you read it within the context of something, what it comes to mean is it's something that is indispensable, something that is essential, something that is a necessity. It is a must. It is a prerequisite before something else can happen. You absolutely have to have it. That's sine qua non. Let me give you some examples so that we're all on the same page. An author's sine qua non is his or her imagination, without which he or she will not be successful. Do you see how it works now? Without which not. An author's sine qua non, that thing that is indispensable, is imagination. These are things I made up. You may disagree with them, but these are things I made up to give you examples. Confidence is a brain surgeon's sine qua non, without which he would not be able to handle the pressure. Imagine operating on a human being in any way, but especially on the brain, something so highly sensitive. Any slip of the hand could cause permanent, irreparable damage, even death. So confidence is an indispensable characteristic in a surgeon, especially one who is a brain surgeon. I would say something like customer service must be the sine qua non of every retail store, without which it would not be able to stand out from its competitors. There are lots of people out here who provide services, lots of people who provide goods. But customer service is what keeps people coming back, right? You can pick a number of places in town to get your car fixed if you're in a wreck. But if you want it done right and done back to the way it was, even better so, you better take it to Randall. Because Randall's sine qua non is integrity. He's not going to cheat anybody, and he's going to do it right. And if he doesn't, he'll do it again. So if you don't have customer service, you've got nothing as a retail business. That's the sine qua non of a business. Of course, this is, again, from my vantage point, this is my way of thinking. You could substitute anything. So we've got some golfers in the audience, like Sandy and Barb. We might say a repeatable swing is the sine qua non of every low-scoring player. If you don't play golf, you don't understand what that means. But if you play golf, you know the one thing you want to do is copy your swing. Do the same thing over and over. Why? Because you want to be able to hit the ball in the same way over and over and over. Chefs might say that fresh ingredients, as opposed to frozen ingredients, are the sine qua non of fine dining. A teenage boy who loves a girl from a distance. She does not know of his love, but he loves her from a distance and watches her and pines for her. He might say that she is the sine qua non of his existence. She is indispensable in his young life. The sine qua non is the essential thing, the one thing you cannot do without, the absolute necessity. And so as a disciple, as a Christian, what is the sine qua non of our beliefs? What is at the heart of our belief system? If you're wondering how well you understand Christianity, if you've ever wondered that, you know, how well do I really grasp what it means to be a Christian, to be a disciple of Jesus? All you've got to do is try and explain those tenets of faith to your 14-year-old daughter. Aspen and I had the privilege of going to a movie together just the other day, and on the way down there, we began to talk about the more important things of life, the eternal things. Talk about things like sin. Talk about things like God and His purity and His holiness and what it means to be sovereign, which means He's never wrong. Justice and His love and mercy and grace, and how does that fit into when we sin, and how does He view us? And if you want to know how well you grasp it, try and explain it to a 14-year-old girl who is, even though she is my daughter, she is quite bright and quite mature. It's difficult. I found myself using big words and going, oh wait, don't say that. She's not going to understand that. And so as I thought about that with her, and as I stumbled across this phrase, sine qua non, and I thought, and I began to put things through the old brain mill. As those of you know me know I do that all the time, just always thinking and trying to go down several paths to figure something out. Here's where I started. Well, since we talk all the time about Jesus being the Lord of this church and he's the focus of everything, Jesus is our sine qua non, the perfect Son of God who loves us more than we know. And that's absolutely true. There is a lot of truth to that statement, but why is Jesus the indispensable thing in our life? What is it about him? Is there more about him that makes him so? Otherwise, he's just another Jewish carpenter. He's just another Jewish martyr in centuries-long lines of Jewish martyrs. Yes, Jesus is indispensable, but I think there's something more. Then I began to go, okay, well, grace is our sine qua non, because those of us who grew up in a more legalistic environment have learned to come and love and embrace and totally be flushed with grace. So grace is our sine qua non, because grace is something we can't earn from God, and on. But then I said, but what is grace really? Well, it's God forgiving even though we don't deserve to be forgiven. Yeah, but why? How can he do that? And I went right down the Christian attributes. Where does grace come from? Well, maybe it's mercy. Maybe it's forgiveness. Maybe it's hope. Our sine qua non is love, because Paul says there's faith and there's hope and there's love, but the greatest of these things is love. And yet, even that, and the Bible even says in 1 John that God is love. So love must be the sine qua non. It must be the indispensable thing in all of Christianity. But yet, I'm a man of action, personally. I believe in action. And I believe that God is a God of action. And therefore, if you have love, you have a strong emotion. If you have love, or you say, I love you, I love someone, and yet there is no action behind it, that is nothing but a strong emotion. If you don't believe that, then here's an example for you to think about. Tell your wife on a daily basis, maybe several times daily, that you love her. I love you, Kelly. I love you, Shug. I love you. But don't ever show her. In fact, by your actions, contradict that with the harsh, mean things that you say to her. And don't ever take her out. And don't ever surprise her with gifts. Don't ever come do the dishes for her. Don't ever do things that demonstrate that love. And she is going to see the love that I'm saying coming out of my mouth is nothing more than empty words. Right? Tell your children, I love you, kids. I love you, Coda. I love you, Maddie. I love you, Aspen. But you don't ever take them to a movie. You don't ever get them things that they need. You don't ever hug them up in your lap and just hold them for no reason, or read them books, or play ball with them, or videotape them while they twirl or while they cheer. But you tell them every day, I love you, I love you, I love you. They're going to grow up with a hollow sense of what love really is if you don't ever demonstrate. The point is, love demands action. And so even if to say, well, love is our sine qua non, I have to go, no, I don't know. Yes, it's essential, but I'm looking for the very thing that is so indispensable that it becomes the source. It becomes the ocean from which all other rivers flow. God is a God of action, I know, because the Bible tells us in Romans 5:6-8 that Christ arrives right on time to make this happen, this thing called forgiveness. He didn't and doesn't wait for us to get ready. He presented himself for this sacrificial death when we were far too weak and rebellious to do anything to get ourselves ready. And even if we hadn't been so weak, we wouldn't have known what to do anyway. We can understand someone dying for a person worth dying for, and we can understand how someone good and noble could inspire us to selfless sacrifice. But God put his love on the line for us by offering his Son in sacrificial death while we were of no use whatever to him. That is the key to love and action. And so as I began to think, okay, what is the most necessary thing? What is the thing that ties all of these together? And what ties all of these together is the sacrifice of blood. The sine qua non ties all of these things: grace and love and hope and faith and Jesus and forgiveness and assurance. All of those things are tied together through blood. Jesus can only be the sine qua non of Christianity because he gave his life for the life of the world. God can only pour out his grace and his mercy and his forgiveness because Jesus' blood provides a way to do that. God is love. And Paul says the greatest of faith, hope, and love is love. But how do we know? If God did not sacrifice his son, then love would be nothing more than some cerebral activity in God's mind. Again, the most famous, probably, passage in the New Testament, at least quoted by Christians and non-Christians alike, is John 3:16, but I like it in the Message. This is how much God loved the world. He gave his son, his one and only son. And this is why, so that no one need be destroyed. By believing in him, anyone can have a whole and lasting life. If you want to sum up the love of God in 2 words, it's very, very, very simple. Remember it always. God gave. That's it. You want to sum up love? God's love. God gave. 2 words that silence all the critics. They inspire authors and they baffle us in its greatness. When God gave Jesus, it wasn't like Jesus was some runway model for the world to prance up and down the stage of earth saying, listen to me and look at me, and then I'm going to be gone. Jesus had but one essential mission. In fact, Jesus could say, my sine qua non, my essential mission is to bleed and to die for mankind. Now the question becomes, why is blood, from a spiritual perspective, why is blood so important? Because to God, blood equals life. That's why. Blood equals life. This goes back to Leviticus 17, a passage in the Old Testament where God is trying to explain this very concept about life and blood and sacrifice. And I've got it in 2 different versions. You only have one. The first is from the Message. Here's what God says. If any Israelite or foreigner living among them, among you, eats blood, he's talking to Moses, I will disown that person and cut him off from his people, for the life of an animal is in the blood. I have provided the blood for you to make atonement for your lives on the altar. It is the blood, the life, that makes atonement. Now listen to it in the contemporary English version. I will turn against any of my people who eat blood. This also includes any foreigners living among you. Life is in the blood, and I have given you the blood of animals to sacrifice, look at the last part, in place of your own. You understand what he's saying there? God is saying, look, don't eat blood. And by the way, we're not going to get into a discussion of do you like your steaks rare or well done. That's not the point. God is showing his people, I do not want you to eat the blood of the animals because the blood has a specific purpose. It's not about being edible or not being edible. It's about atonement. I am giving you animals. I'm letting you kill them. I'm letting you take their blood and sprinkle it so that you don't have to do it to yourself. The reason that blood is the sine qua non of human life, the thing you cannot do without, is because God created us that way. But I don't think God did that because God could have created us in any way. He could have made any part of our bodies the sine qua non. He could have made, our body has a lot of water in it. He could have made water. But you can dehydrate for quite a while and still live. You can't lose your blood and live. I don't think it has much to do with sustaining physical life as it does that God was showing blood is about life and blood is required for atonement. Now some of you are going, atonement, that's a word I hear and I don't really understand that, so let's make it real easy. Atonement is best defined as at-one-ment. That is, being at peace with God. Atonement is at-one-ment. When we sin, and everyone sins, God expects payment because sin is rebellion against God. God designed us and created us to live for him and not sin. And when we choose, we do just like Adam and Eve in the garden, and we rebel and we say, we're going to do what we want anyway. And when we do that, God demands payment. But see, and when we sin, God can't fellowship that. He can't be in the same room with us. He can't put his arm around us and say, come here, child. He can't do that with sin. It separates us from him. And so when you read the Old Testament and you read Deuteronomy and you read Exodus and you read especially Leviticus and you read about bring this animal and bring a 1-year-old lamb, and if you don't have that, bring some pigeons and bring some, and you read all these offerings and you're going, this is confusing. I don't understand it. What you need to understand, even if you can't pinpoint all the details, is that the sacrificial system was set up for one very important reason. For the Hebrews to take an animal and say, here, God, accept this instead of me. Even if you can't figure out okay, the sin offering, that was supposed to be a goat, but the transgression offering, that's supposed to, even if you can't remember that, you don't even need to know that. What you need to know is that when God set up the sacrificial system with a high priest and priests and altars and burning fat and blood, the point was to say, this I am accepting in your place, people. Israel, as well as many other world religions, then sacrificed animals and spilled blood so that they could be atoned for, so that they could be at one, at peace with God. Here's one big problem with that system. Our God is a God who is quid pro quo, which means he wants an equal exchange. This is just a bonus word for you today. I'm not going to count this one against you. This is one you can just tuck away as free. Quid pro quo literally means something for something. God is quid pro quo. If you sin, he wants something back of equal value. Can you see how sacrificing animal blood for human sin becomes a problem? Yes, because animals don't sin. They don't choose to rebel against God, and we do. And yet those people used blood as something to give back to God so that he would atone for them. Let me give you an example. How many have heard of an eye for an eye and tooth for tooth, limb for limb, life for life? Ever heard that before? That's quid pro quo. I mean, your neighbor comes up to you and punches you in the nose, knocks you down. You don't want to go spank his dog. You want to punch him back in the nose. That's quid pro quo. And God is a God that is quid pro quo, and he says, when you sin, I've got to have equal payment in return. Guess what? It doesn't work that way. And you're about to see why. That old sacrificial system, that old plan, was only a hint of the good things in the new plan. Since that old law plan wasn't complete in itself, it couldn't complete those who followed it. He's talking about the old system versus Jesus. No matter how many sacrifices were offered year after year, they never added up to a complete solution. If they had, the worshipers would have gone merrily on their way, no longer dragged down by their sins. But instead of removing awareness of sin, when those animal sacrifices were repeated over and over, they actually heightened awareness and guilt. The plain fact is that bull and goat blood can't get rid of sin. Listen, the blood of animals cannot get rid of sin. And yet you read those Old Testament passages and it says, and God forgave them, or I will forgive you when you do this. And so I grew up hearing stuff like, well, God took all those sins and he rolled them forward. Or God took sins and he put them over here and no, God forgave them. You go, well, wait a minute. If the blood of bulls and goats can't take away sin, then how could God forgive? He did it the same way that you can go into a car dealership and sign a piece of paper and drive that car away without paying for the thing in its entirety. You sign an IOU. And that's what God did. God wrote an IOU on all the sins of the world prior to his son coming in. And that's where Jesus comes in. Jesus' blood is our sine qua non because it's the only thing to cleanse us both inside and out. If you want to get a great understanding of this old covenant, Old Testament sacrificial system versus the new system, the new way of life in Jesus, read the book of Hebrews in the New Testament from start to finish. And it is the greatest explanation of that concept in Scripture. But when the Messiah arrived, high priest of the superior things of this new covenant, he bypassed that old tent and its trappings in this created world and went straight into heaven's tent, the true holy place once and for all. He also bypassed the sacrifices consisting of goat and calf blood, instead using his own blood as the price to set us free once for all. If that animal blood and the other rituals of purification were effective in cleaning up certain matters of our religion and behavior, think how much more the blood of Christ cleans up our whole lives inside and out. Through the Spirit, Christ offered himself as an unblemished sacrifice, freeing us from all those dead-end efforts to make ourselves respectable so that we can live all out for God. That is a great passage in Hebrews 9, translated by Peterson in the Message. That tent language and all that, if you've ever read about the temple or the tabernacle, that was what they're talking about. It took a high priest once a year going into the most holy place, and he had to have blood and he had to have smoke, and he did it year after year after year. And what Jesus' blood does is say, this is going to cleanse you inside and out once for all. No more animal blood, no more high priest going in for me, no more taking your animals to the altar. Jesus, the high priest, does it once and for all. See, here's the point. You can have you may be capable of having great faith in God, but if you don't have the blood of Christ in your life, you are small and insignificant. You may know Scripture from Genesis to the maps. I know lots of guys who can quote it backwards and forwards, but they don't live in a blood-drenched way, and therefore their knowledge is useless because Satan can quote it from beginning to end. You may clean up well on Sundays with makeup and hair gel and brush your teeth and have cologne and mouthwash, but if you don't have the blood of Jesus covering your life, you are absolutely filthy in God's sight. His blood is the only thing that can clean up our sin-ridden, mistake-prone, screwed-up people like us. His blood's the only thing that can do it. You know what's interesting about that? You don't think about blood cleansing. In fact, when you get blood in clothes, it's downright hard to get out unless you tackle it right away. And yet it's that blood that the writer of Revelation says makes us white as snow. Jesus' blood is our sine qua non because it's the final solution to the problem of sin. Listen again to Hebrews. That's why blood, the evidence of death, is used so much in our Jewish tradition, especially regarding forgiveness of sins. That accounts for the prominence of blood and death and all of these secondary practices that point to the realities of heaven. Secondary practices like offering bulls and goats and incense. It also accounts for why, when the real thing takes place, these animal sacrifices aren't needed anymore, having served their purpose. For Christ didn't enter the earthly version of the holy place. He entered the place itself and offered himself to God as a sacrifice for our sins. He doesn't do this every year as the high priest did under the old plan with blood that was not their own. If that had been the case, he would have to sacrifice himself repeatedly throughout the course of history. But instead, he sacrificed himself once for all, summing up all the other sacrifices in this sacrifice of himself, the final solution of sin. Everyone has to die once and then face the consequences. Christ's death was also a one-time event, but it was a sacrifice that took care of sins forever. And so, when he next appears, the outcome for those eager to greet him is precisely salvation. The problem of sin is that when you sin, you die. Just like Adam and Eve, you die physically. But more importantly, you die spiritually. You separate from God. That's why you're separated from God. That's why the priests had a full-time job. They could never sit down. All they did was do shifts. You know, these factories we have all around here that run shifts, 12 hours on, and you go home and more guys come in and there's somebody working all the time. That's the job of the priests at the temple in the old covenant. Sin separates, so they have to work every day, year in, year out. They couldn't stop because the animal blood was not a final solution. Jesus' blood was. And because of that, our message to other people, the Christian message to other people, is not one of superiority or we're holier than thou, but rather one for hope of the future. Isn't it ironic that Hitler, his propaganda and his message was that the annihilation of all Jews was the final solution? Isn't it ironic that God used a Jew to handle the final solution of Hitler's sin? I don't think he chose it, but it was there for his choosing. Jesus' blood, last of all, is our sine qua non because it provides the open door into God's presence. Back to Hebrews. So, friends, we can now, without hesitation, walk right up to God into the holy place. Jesus has cleared the way by the blood of his sacrifice, acting as our priest before God. The curtain into God's presence is his body. So let's do it, full of belief, confident that we're presentable inside and out. Let's keep a firm grip on the promises that keep us going. He always keeps his word. Did you know that no other religion in the world can boast such confidence as this? I can go right into the very presence of the creator of the entire universe, the God of heaven. And he doesn't see me as a criminal. He doesn't see me as a child who needs to be whipped over and over. If I am his child, I go in as a child comes in to you. right into his very presence. When you want to talk to your Father, to our Father, you don't have to go through some priest. You don't have to go through some middleman. You don't have to jump through hoops. You can walk right into his presence. You can lay down all your requests, all your burdens, all your heartaches. And the reason that you can do that is because Jesus' blood paved the way in every way. Jesus' blood is the sine qua non of our existence, of life, because it was the perfect sacrifice by a perfect person to perfect some very imperfect people.